A Russian bomber just entered Alaskan Airspace. Standard intercept, standard procedure. Except there's a civilian aircraft flying right in front of it. 240 passengers between her and the target. Her commander says execute standard procedure. She says the standard procedure is exactly what the Russians planned for. They didn't come here to reach the coast. They came here to make an American fighter jet maneuver next to a passenger plane on camera. She has 30 seconds to find a move that isn't in any manual. Her father spent 22 years teaching chess in a Fairbanks classroom. He said, "You don't win by attacking the piece that's threatening you. You win by controlling the square it needs to move through." She's about to find out if he was right. Captain Quinn Farris had been flying F-15s for 6 years, and she had understood one thing from her first hour in the cockpit that most pilots learned much later, if they learned it at all. The airplane was not the problem. The problem was always the airspace. The F-15C Eagle was, by every measurable standard, the most capable air superiority fighter the United States Air Force had ever built. Not because of any single capability, because of the combination. The thrust-to-weight ratio that allowed vertical full flight, the instantaneous turn rate that most aircraft could not match, the radar suite that could track multiple targets from beyond visual range and engage them before they knew you were there. The airframe that had been improved and updated through 4 decades of operational use, and had never, not once, in any turning engagement against a hostile aircraft, been beaten. The aircraft was designed to dominate the space around it. But the space itself had rules. The space had ROE and weather and other aircraft that had rights in it, and diplomatic geometry that meant what you could do in some areas of the space was different from what you could do in others. The rules were not the same everywhere, and the rules were, in Quinn's considered opinion, where every interesting problem lived. She had grown up in Fairbanks, Alaska, which was the specific kind of childhood that produced either people who couldn't wait to leave or people who could not imagine themselves anywhere else. She was the second kind. The cold and the dark and the specific quality of the northern sky had shaped her in ways she could not fully separate from herself. And she had come back to Alaska after trizzing stints in other places, because Alaska was where she understood the sky in the way she needed to understand it. Not just technically, physically, the way you understood something you had been inside since you were old enough to walk outside. Fairbanks sat at 64 degrees north latitude, which meant that the sky over it behaved differently from the sky over most places where people learned to fly. The summer nights barely darkened. The winter days were so short they felt like extended twilights, the sun making a low arc just above the southern horizon before disappearing again. The aurora borealis moved through the upper atmosphere in patterns that had nothing to do with human navigation systems, sheets, and curtains of light in colors that the atmosphere at lower latitudes did not produce. The weather came from directions the forecast models sometimes got wrong, because the models were calibrated to conditions that the central Alaska interior only approximated. She had grown up reading this sky, not in the formal way she later learned to read it as a pilot, with altimeter settings and wind shear reports and icing forecasts and all the instruments of the meteorological system. She had read it the way a child reads anything she loves, with total, unstructured attention, noticing what changed and what did not, building a model before she had a formal framework to put the model in. Her mother, Grace Farris, had been an air traffic controller at Fairbanks International for 24 years. Quinn had grown up with a specific understanding of airspace that most pilots lacked, because most pilots learned about airspace from only one side of it. She had seen it from both sides. From the ground, looking up with radar and radio, and the responsibility for dozens of lives arranged in 3 dimensions. Invisible to the eye but fully present on the scope, each blip a machine with people in it moving at speeds that demanded attention from the moment they entered the system to the moment they were safely down. And from the air, looking out with instruments and training, and the specific knowledge that somewhere below, someone was watching and managing the space she occupied. The air was not empty. It was managed. The management had rules, and the rules existed to protect the people in the air, not to serve the rules themselves. This was the thing her mother had always known, that Quinn had absorbed without being taught it explicitly. The rules were instrumental. They served a purpose. The purpose was primary. The rules were secondary. This was not the way that Emery thought about it. And the difference between how Quinn thought about it and how Emery thought about it was the specific professional tension that had defined her 3 years in the 19th Fighter Squadron. She had been stationed at Joint Base Elmendorf-Richardson in Anchorage for those 3 years, 90 minutes by air from Fairbanks on a good day. She visited when she could. She called her father on Sunday evenings. She had been doing this since she left for the academy 8 years ago, and the Sunday call had become the fixed point of her week. The conversation she was always partly preparing for without knowing it, because her father was the one person she spoke with who had known her before any of this and who had given her the framework she flew inside. Her father was Martin Farris. He had been the chess coach at Lathrop High School in Fairbanks for 22 years and a math teacher for those same 22 years, because at Lathrop the chess coach and the math teacher were the same person, and Martin had been fine with that arrangement. He played chess the way he did mathematics, patiently, with an engineer's respect for structure and a poet's appreciation for the unexpected move. He had been the state junior champion in 1979 at 17. He had not played competitively since. He had discovered, in the years after, that teaching chess was more interesting than winning at it, because winning told you what you already knew, and teaching showed you what you had not thought to articulate. He had taught Quinn to play when she was 6 years old, not because she asked, because he had watched her for 5 years and concluded that she was the kind of child who needed a game with enough structure to channel her intelligence and enough depth to keep her interested. She was curious and patient, and she noticed everything around her, and she was bored by problems that resolved quickly. Chess, he decided, would suit her. He had been correct. He had started with the basics, how each piece moved, the object of the game, the names of the openings. But the lesson that had mattered most had not come from any formal instruction. It had come from watching her play. She had been 12 years old and playing in the state junior qualifier. She had been in a position where her opponent's queen was threatening her rook. The obvious move was to move the rook to safety. She had moved the rook. She had lost the game in 11 moves. After the game, her father had said, simply, "Why did you move the rook?" She had said, "Because it was under attack." He had said, "What was your opponent's queen trying to do?" She had thought about it. She had gone back through the position in her mind. She had seen, in the 3 minutes of reviewing the game, what she had not seen in the 30 minutes of playing it. She had said, "She was trying to get my rook so she could open the C-file for her bishop." He had nodded. He had said, "And when you moved the rook, what happened to the C-file?" She had said quietly, "I opened it for her." He had nodded again. He had said, "The rook was not the problem. The C-file was the problem. She showed you the rook because she needed you to think about the rook. She was thinking about the C-file the whole time." She had been 12 years old. She had gone home from the qualifier that afternoon and set up the board in her room. and played the game again from the beginning, trying to find the move where she had stopped seeing the C file and started seeing only the rook. She found it. She was 8 moves in. At move 9, her opponent had offered the queen trade that protected the rook, and Quinn had accepted. And in accepting, she had failed to notice that the queen trade also opened the diagonal that the bishop needed. She had set up the position again. She had thought about what the correct move at move 9 was, not to save the rook, but to deny the diagonal. There was a move. It was not obvious. It required giving up the rook entirely, accepting the loss of the piece, in order to control the square that the bishop needed to reach. The rook would be gone, but the position would be closed, and the bishop would have nowhere to go. She had brought this to her father. He had looked at the board for a long time. Then he had said, "You found it." He had paused. "Now tell me what you were thinking when you found it." She had said, "I stopped looking at what the opponent was attacking. I looked at what the opponent needed to attack with." He had said, "Yes." He had looked at her. "You will use this for the rest of your life, in things that have nothing to do with chess." He had been right about that too. There was a second lesson that came later, when she was 15 and had been playing seriously for 9 years. She had been in a game where she had a positional advantage and had pressed it too directly, trying to turn the positional advantage into an immediate tactical win rather than consolidating the position and letting the advantage develop over time. She had overreached. The opponent had found a tactical sequence she had not seen and had reversed the outcome entirely. Her father had said, after the game, "You had the position and you tried to make it into a tactic." She had said, "Yes, I thought I could finish it faster." He had said, "The position was worth 3 times what the tactic was worth. You traded something large for something small." He had paused. The hardest thing to learn in chess is not how to find the brilliant move. It is how to not play the brilliant move when the correct move is the quiet one. She had thought about this for a long time after. The quiet move. The move that did not announce itself. The move that simply improved the position without triggering a response, because the opponent did not yet understand what the position had become. She had been practicing quiet moves for 15 years. In chess, in aviation, in every meeting room and briefing room, and ready room where she had understood something that was not yet obvious, and had decided that the quiet move was to simply continue doing the work rather than announce what she understood. Emery would have called this patience. She called it information management. The distinction was not academic. The specific principle she had derived from that game and its aftermath was this: you do not win by defending the piece that is under attack. You win by denying the piece that is doing the attacking the resource it needs to attack. The threat is visible. The resource that enables the threat is not always visible. The player who sees the resource can close it. The player who sees only the threat is always responding to what the opponent has already done. She had been flying with that principle for 18 years. It had translated into aviation in ways she had never needed to explain. Because the translation was intuitive, and because the people who needed to understand it tended to understand it when they saw it applied. The people who did not understand it sometimes described her as creative, which was not the word she would have used. She was not creative. She was looking at the board. She was the only female F-15C pilot in the 19th Fighter Squadron. She had been this for 3 years without making a particular issue of it, because making an issue of it would have been, in her assessment, a distraction from the work, and the work was what interested her. This was not indifference. It was strategy. She had learned in the specific way of people who have had to learn it, that calling attention to her difference in a room where some people thought she did not belong produced one of 2 effects. A conversation that was not about the work, or a silence that was about nothing but the fact of her presence. Neither was useful. She preferred to let the work speak. Her call sign was Bishop. It had been given to her during initial qualification at Tyndall, when her flight instructor learned about her father. The 19th had a tradition. Call signs were supposed to capture something real and slightly unflattering about the pilot. The flight instructor had said, during the debrief of her 4th qualification sortie, after she had solved a 2 versus 1 engagement by positioning herself between the 2 aggressors rather than engaging either one directly. The bishop in chess moves at an angle. Not straight, not in an L like the knight, always at an angle. He had looked at her. We'll see if that fits. It fit. She had never told anyone she was pleased with it, because the call sign had not been given as a compliment. It had been given with the specific mixture of admiration and mild exasperation that characterized how her flight instructor had felt about her approach to the qualification syllabus. She flew the book perfectly when the book was the right answer. When the book was not the right answer, she found a different answer without asking permission. This was useful, and also, from a training standpoint, complicated. Colonel Brad Emery commanded the 19th Fighter Squadron. He was 50 years old, from Pensacola, Florida. He had flown F-15Cs over Iraq during the early years of the war, when the threat was primarily ground-based, and the challenge was integrating the strike and air superiority missions in a congested battle space, and then F-15Cs for a decade afterward in assignments that had taken him from Langley to Kadena to Nellis, and finally to JBR. He was, by most measures, an excellent commander, organized, fair, technically proficient, genuinely interested in the development of the pilots under his command. He was also a man who believed, with the conviction that comes from experience, that procedures existed for reasons, and that the reasons mattered more than the individual pilot's judgment about whether the procedure applied. This was a reasonable belief. Procedures in military aviation were written in the specific way that procedures in high-stakes environments were written. In response to accidents, every procedure had a history. Every deviation carried a risk that the procedure existed to prevent. A pilot who deviated from procedure was not merely deviating from a rule. They were accepting the risk that the rule existed to mitigate, and accepting it on behalf of everyone who would be affected by the outcome. Emery had said this to Quinn in one form or another 3 times in 3 years. The first time had been at her intake briefing, 2 weeks after she arrived at the 19th. He had reviewed her file. He had seen Air Force Academy, FTC, initial qualification at Tyndall, followed by a series of performance evaluations that noted consistently that she flew with exceptional precision within standard parameters and with exceptional creativity outside them. The word creativity appeared in her record 7 times, always in a context that made clear it was not entirely intended as a compliment. He had said, "I've read your file. I see you have a history of finding approaches to problems that are not in the standard procedure." He had paused. "I want you to understand something before you start flying here. The ADIZ is not the place for that. The ADIZ is the place where we execute the procedure correctly and document it carefully and send it up the chain. The consequences of getting it wrong here are different from the consequences of getting it wrong elsewhere." She had said, "I understand that, sir." He had said, "I hope so." She had understood something that he had not said, which was that he was telling her this specifically because of who she was. Not every pilot received this speech at intake. She knew this because she had spoken to the 3 pilots who had arrived at the 19th in the previous year, and none of them described a similar conversation. She was not resentful about this. She filed it. The second time had been after the DR Ops situation. When her name came up for the alert roster 18 months into her assignment, the squadron's director of operations, a colonel named Tate, who had 17 years in fighter aviation and whose record showed no experience flying alongside women in any operational capacity, had filed a written objection. Emery had showed her the objection, which was not required, but which she understood as a form of professional respect he was choosing to offer. The objection said, "Captain Farris demonstrates strong technical proficiency in standard operational parameters. However, her approach to problem solving is characterized by improvisational tendencies under ambiguity. The NORAD intercept mission requires split-second execution of established procedures in a high-stakes environment where the geopolitical consequences of error are significant. Alert duty does not reward creativity. Recommend assignment to standard operational rotations pending further qualification review and demonstrated procedural discipline." She had read this twice. She had looked at Emery. He had not said, "This objection is partly about who you are rather than what you do." He had not needed to say it. She was aware that Tate had not filed comparable objections for 3 male pilots in the squadron whose performance records showed similar tendencies toward procedural flexibility. She had checked, not to build a case, but to understand the environment she was operating in. Emery had said, "I'm overriding the objection. I'm putting you on the roster, but I want you to understand that the objection exists and that my decision to override it is part of the record." He had held her gaze. "I need you to give me reason not to regret this decision." She had said, "Yes, sir, I understand." She had understood everything he said. She had also understood that the situation created a specific kind of accountability that her male colleagues on the alert roster did not carry in the same way. If she performed well, she would be seen as having performed well. If she deviated from procedure and was wrong, she would be seen as having confirmed the concern the objection had raised. She was flying with a margin her colleagues did not have. She was aware of this. She took it seriously. Since then, she had been in 2 formal counselings about procedural deviation. The first had been 15 months ago. She had used an unconventional approach vector on an intercept to avoid flying through the radar cone of a Russian Il-20 surveillance aircraft she had identified on the way to the primary contact. The approach was not in the TTP. It was slower and used more fuel. It also produced a better identification opportunity without the surveillance aircraft complicating the picture. Emery had said, "I understand why you did it. I cannot approve of it. If you had been less capable, the approach would have been too slow and you would have burned through your fuel margin. We write procedures because they have to work for every pilot on the schedule." He had paused. "The DIR Ops objection is still in your file. I need you to give me fewer reasons to second-guess my decision." She had said, "Yes, sir." She had meant it. The fuel margin concern was real and the replicability problem was real. These were legitimate objections. She held both of those things alongside the fact that the approach she had used was correct for the specific situation, and she did not try to resolve the tension between them because the tension was real. The second counseling had been 8 months ago. Similar deviation, different context. Emery had said, "Recurrent concern." She had said, "Yes, sir." She had gone back to the ready room and thought about the gap between what she was doing and what the procedure required, and concluded, as she had before, that the gap was sometimes warranted and sometimes not, and that the judgment required to identify which was not something that could be fully encoded in writing, but could be partially encoded, and that her job was to try. Her wingman on the alert roster was First Lieutenant Jasper Kwan, 27 years old, from Honolulu, 800 total hours, 18 months in the squadron. Good pilot. Flew the book. Asked the right questions when he did not know something. Quinn liked him. She was careful around him in the specific way of someone who understood that the approaches she sometimes used would look different if Quinn attempted them without her 6 years of this airspace in his body. Emery was right about this. She worked around it by being, when she flew with Quinn, a more procedural version of herself than she was alone, and by saving the conversations about when and how to deviate for moments when they could talk through the reasoning completely. She was in the ready room on a Tuesday morning in November when the scramble order came. The alert went off at 0847. She was in the aircraft at 0849. She was airborne at 0853. Cavant was on her wing 20 seconds behind. She was climbing through 15,000 feet when the NORAD controller's voice came through with the contact information, transmitted in the compressed, precise language of people who had learned to communicate maximum information in minimum time. Primary contact. Russian 295 MS, bearing 287, 38,000 feet, inside the outer boundary of the ADZ. Transponder off, not squawking. Speed consistent with the Bear H variant. Approximately 500 knots. Course 110, southeast. Standard parameters. Standard intercept. Then the controller said the second part. Secondary contact, bearing 285, 39,500 feet. Transponder squawking 2D631. Identified as Vladivostok Air Charter Flight VKO 441. Filed flight plan Vladivostok to Vancouver. 520 knots, course 108 degrees. 2 degrees difference in bearing, 1,500 feet of vertical separation, nearly identical course. Quinn did not respond immediately. She processed it. The secondary contact was a civil aviation aircraft, Ilyushin EL-76TD in passenger configuration, the large 4-engine transport that could carry upward of 200 passengers in charter tar configuration. VKO 4471 had filed correctly with the FAA, was squawking correctly, was on a legitimate routing from Vladivostok to Vancouver through the Alaskan offshore airspace. The routing was unusual. Most Vladivostok-Vancouver traffic went south over Japan, but not impermissible. 240 people, the controller said. Passenger manifest filed with Vancouver approach. She said, copy secondary contact. Confirm primary is the Bear. The controller confirmed. Formation spacing approximately half nautical mile. She sat with this, the 295 50 seconds, behind a civil aviation aircraft, on essentially the same course. In the ADIZ, without authorization, without a transponder squawking. She thought, this is not an accident. The recognition arrived before the analysis. This was how she had always known when something was important. The body knew before the mind caught up. She had learned to trust the body's recognition and then let the mind do its work of figuring out why the recognition was correct. The analysis came quickly. She had been flying ADIZ intercepts for 2 years, and she had been studying Russian air activity in the North Pacific for 6. And she knew this. The Russians did not position their aircraft by accident. Every formation, every approach vector, every altitude choice was deliberate. When a 295 appeared in the ADIZ, it appeared in exactly the configuration its crew intended it to appear in. The only question was always, what were they trying to do? Standard intercept procedure required approaching from behind and below, matching speed, closing to visual identification range, pulling alongside for visual ID. You pulled within a few hundred feet. The pull alongside was the critical phase. It required maneuvering your aircraft in close proximity to the contact, and if done correctly, it took you from behind the contact, past the contact's 6 o'clock, and alongside the contact's fuselage in a single extended approach. If the contact was a 295, flying half a nautical mile behind a civilian aircraft with 240 people aboard, The approach to visual identification range would take you past the civilian aircraft's 6 o'clock at less than a mile. The wake turbulence zone of the Il-76 extended at least a mile behind and below. The standard approach would put her in that zone. Standard civil aviation rows: do not enter the wake turbulence zone of a civil aviation aircraft. Do not maneuver within specified separation parameters. She said, Bishop copies all. Confirm row E for the civilian contact. The controller confirmed standard civil aviation protections. Do not interfere. Do not approach within wake turbulence parameters. She said, copy, stand by. She thought about it. The 295 was inside the Il-76's wake turbulence zone by design. Not catastrophically inside. The formation was keeping a workable separation, but inside enough that executing the standard approach to the 295 meant maneuvering an F-15 through the turbulence zone of a fully loaded civilian transport with 240 passengers. She could do it. The turbulence would affect the F-15, but not dangerously. The turbulence zone was not a prohibited zone for military aircraft. She could execute the standard approach within the letter of the ROE. But that was not the problem. The problem was that the Russian crew had constructed this formation specifically because it created a picture. An American military fighter maneuvering aggressively within close range of a civilian plane with 240 people aboard. That picture was worth something. It was worth a press statement. It was worth a diplomatic note. It was worth a news cycle. The Russian crew was not primarily flying toward the Alaskan coast. They were flying toward the situation where NORAD executed its standard procedure and generated the imagery their political officers needed. She thought about her father. She thought about the state qualifier when she was 12. She thought about moving the rook. She said, Bishop copies. Bishop 2, standard formation. Hold at current station, Quan said. Bishop 2 copies. Emery's voice came on the channel. Monitoring from the ops center at J-Bar, as he always monitored, he said, Bishop, execute standard intercept. She said, copy, sir. Bishop requests 30 seconds. He said, negative. Execute standard intercept. She said, sir, the geometry creates a problem. I'm developing a picture, he said. I have the picture. Execute standard intercept. She thought, you have the picture in 2 dimensions. You have the bearing and the altitude and the separation. You do not have what I have, which is 2 years of watching these crews work and 18 years of understanding what a position means. She said, sir, copy, stand by 30 seconds. She did not execute the standard intercept. She ran it through instead. The standard approach defended the rook. She needed to look at the C file. What was the 295 crew's C file? What resource were they relying on to maintain their advantage in this position? They were relying on the airspace ahead of the Il-76. Specifically, they were relying on the Il-76 being in the intercept zone between and the approaching F-15, which denied the standard approach, which produced either a contaminated approach near the civilian aircraft or an inability to approach at all. That was their resource, the airspace the Il-76 was moving toward, and the Il-76's presence in the intercept zone. Could she deny that resource? She thought about the Bishop. The Bishop moved diagonally. It did not attack the piece directly in front of it. It attacked across the board, along a diagonal that the other pieces could not easily block, occupying squares from a distance. The Bishop's power was not in the piece it was threatening, but in the line it controlled. You could see the piece it was aimed at and miss the 2 other squares it was simultaneously covering. You could defend against the visible threat and discover that the diagonal had been the problem all along. The standard intercept aimed at the 295 directly, behind and below match speed, close to visual range. This was correct for the standard situation. The standard situation did not involve a civilian aircraft in the formation. The standard situation was designed for a single contact in open airspace. For the situation that existed right now, the standard approach aimed at the wrong piece. The 295 was not the piece she needed to think about. The airspace ahead of the Il-76 was the piece she needed to think about. If she could deny that airspace to the 295 lost the resource it needed to maintain its advantage. The position collapsed, and from the collapsed position, the standard approach became available to Quinn. She could not touch the Il-76. She could not enter its approach cone. She could not enter its wake turbulence zone. Civil aviation protections were not negotiable. But she could be in the airspace the Il-76 was going to move through. Not between the two aircraft. She could not insert herself between them. But ahead of both, on the route the Il-76 was following according to its filed flight plan, outside every protected parameter, simply present in the space that the 295 needed to keep the civilian aircraft as a buffer. The Il-76's filed routing took it through a specific corridor to the east of her current position. She could reach that corridor. She could position herself in it, above and ahead of the Il-76's altitude, outside the approach cone, outside the turbulence zone, and she could simply be there, present, in the space. The Il-76 would pass through on its route. It had right of passage. It would continue to Vancouver. The 295 would find that the airspace the Il-76 was moving toward contained an F-15. The Russian crew would understand what this meant. They were professionals. They would see that maintaining their formation relationship with the civilian aircraft meant moving toward an F-15 that was waiting in the space they needed. They would have two choices: break formation, which meant separating from the civilian cover and exposing themselves to a clean standard intercept from Quinn, or continue on course and approach an F-15 in intercept position. Neither choice was what they had planned for. She said, "NORAD, Bishop. I'm positioning ahead of VKO 4471 on its flight plan corridor. I will be outside the civil aviation approach cone and outside wake turbulence parameters. I am not approaching either contact. I am positioning in airspace that is on the secondary contact's current routing." Emery's voice came immediately. He said, "Bishop, negative. Execute standard intercept." She said, "Sir, the standard intercept in the current geometry requires maneuvering within the civil aviation aircraft's wake turbulence zone at the critical approach phase. The primary contact is using the secondary's shadow position to deny clean intercept. If I position ahead of the secondary on its routing, outside all protected parameters, the primary will be forced to deviate from the formation or approach me directly. When it deviates, Bishop 2 executes standard intercept from behind." Emery said, "That is not the standard intercept procedure." She said, "Sir, I am not approaching VKO 4471. I am positioning in airspace the Il-76 will pass through on its current routing. The civil aviation aircraft passes through that corridor on its filed flight plan and continues to its destination. I remain outside its approach cone and outside its turbulence zone. I am approaching no aircraft. I am controlling airspace. Silence on the channel." The Il-76 was continuing on its course. 4 minutes, approximately, before the geometry resolved one way or another. The window was there now. It would not always be there, Emery said. "Hold. Do not maneuver." She said, "Sir, I have approximately 4 minutes before the picture changes regardless of action." He said, "I said hold, Bishop." She said, "Yes, sir." She held. 90 seconds. She tracked the Il-76 on radar and watched the geometry and did not maneuver. She was aware of the clock. She was aware of the window narrowing. She held position and breathed and waited. The specific quality of waiting that her father had taught her, holding a difficult position without rushing to resolve it, accepting the discomfort of not knowing, staying present on the board. Then Emery said, "Bishop, proceed to your proposed position. You are authorized," she said. "Copy. Bishop 2, hold current station. Execute standard intercept from behind when the primary separates from the secondary." Quinn said, "Bishop 2 copies, standing by." She turned to her position. The move was not aggressive. That was the entire point. She flew ahead on the Il-76's track, above the civilian aircraft's altitude by 2,500 feet, outside the approach cone, outside the turbulence zone. She was in airspace, just airspace, present in the specific section of sky that the Il-76 was going to cross in 2 minutes and that the Tu-95 needed to follow the Il-76 into. She watched the radar. The Il-76 on its course. Steady, legal, legitimate. The crew of that aircraft had no idea what was happening above and behind them. They were flying a filed route, and the route was taking them through the airspace she was now occupying. The Tu-95 was tracking the same course, half a nautical mile behind. She watched the Tu-95's blip on the radar. She counted 15 seconds, then 20, then 30. The Tu-95 broke right. Controlled bank, 45 degrees. Descent of 2,000 feet. Not a dramatic turn. A professional response from a professional crew. They had looked at the board. They had seen the diagonal she had occupied. They had made the rational decision. She said, "Bishop, primary contact is separating from secondary. Breaking right. Bishop 2, you have a clean approach." Quinn said, "Bishop 2 copies. Executing standard intercept." She watched Quinn come in from behind, the approach exactly as the TTP described. Behind and below, matching speed, closing methodically to visual identification range. The Tu-95 crew saw him. They had lost their position. Now they flew the intercept the way you flew an intercept when you were the subject of one, professionally, without drama. Quinn alongside in 90 seconds. He said, "Bishop 2, visual ID confirmed. Tu-95 mess, bare H configuration. 2 hard points under the wings, no stores visible." He paused. "It's waving at me, ma'am," she said. "Wave back. Then escort it to the boundary." He said, "Copy, waving." She watched the Il-76 pass below her. Its lights visible in the pre-dawn dark, 240 people inside, probably finishing their meals or beginning their sleep cycles, unaware that anything unusual had occurred in the airspace above them. The crew was on heading and altitude, working their route, doing nothing wrong. The Tu-95 was breaking away behind them, heading toward the ADIZ boundary with Quinn on its wing. She turned back toward JBR. She thought about the Tu-95 crew, a professional crew who had prepared a clever position and had found it closed. She did not feel triumphant. She felt the specific satisfaction of a problem that had resolved correctly, which was quieter than triumph and more lasting. Her father had said, once, when she was 15 and had won a difficult game at a state qualifier, "The best chess players do not feel good when they win. They feel right. The win is confirmation of the position. The position was what you built." She flew back toward JBR in the thin light of an Alaskan November morning. The debrief was at ZU-930. Emery ran it himself. Timeline, communications, decisions, outcomes. Quinn answered every question directly. She described the geometry in detail, the ROE considerations at each step, the reasoning behind the approach, the specific parameters she had remained within. When he reached the 90-second hold, he paused. He said, "You disobeyed a direct order," she said. "I held position for 90 seconds pending your decision. I did not execute the maneuver during those 90 seconds. He said, "I told you to hold." She said, "Yes, sir, I held. I also informed you of the time constraint and recommended a course of action." You authorized the maneuver," he said. "I authorized it because you had positioned before I could prevent a worse outcome." She said nothing. He said, "You were maneuvering in anticipation of authorization." she said. "I was describing a position to you and waiting for your response. The position I was describing was available for 90 seconds. I was in holding position throughout that time. I was not in violation of ROE at any point." He looked at her for a long time. Around the room, the other pilots were quiet in the way of people watching something that would be in the record. He said, "The outcome was correct." She said, "Yes, sir." He said, "Your interpretation of the geometry was correct." She said, "Yes, sir." He said, "Your execution was outside standard procedure." She said, "Yes, sir." He said, "If a less capable pilot had attempted the same maneuver," she said, "they would not have seen the same position." The approach required understanding what the Russian crew was doing and understanding where the civil aviation aircraft was going to be in 4 minutes. A pilot who did not see both simultaneously would not have developed this solution. They would have executed standard intercept or declared a problem. He said, "And if standard intercept had worked," she said, "it would not have. The formation was specifically designed to deny it." She paused. The 295 crew chose that geometry deliberately. Standard intercept would have required maneuvering near the civilian aircraft. The imagery from that would have been exactly what they came for. She stopped. The third option, denying the position, was the only move that resolved the situation without giving them what they planned to get. Emery was quiet. The room was still. He said, "Where did the third option come from?" She said, "Chess." She said it simply, without apology. "My father taught that you do not win by attacking the piece that is threatening you. You win by controlling the squares it needs to move through." She paused. The 295 needed the airspace ahead of the Il-76. "I occupied that airspace. The rest was their decision." Emery said, "Write it up. Full methodology, every decision point." She said, "Yes, sir." He said, "This goes to NORAD for review. If it holds, it goes into the TTP addendum, under your name." She said, "Yes, sir." He said, "The procedural deviation goes in your record." She said, "Yes, sir." He looked at her. He said, "I need to be able to justify every decision my pilots make in the ADIZ, including the good ones." She said, "I understand that, sir." He said, "I'm not sure you do." He stopped. "When you fly the third move, the pilot who replicates it in a different situation and gets it wrong is using your example as justification. That pilot is your responsibility too." She thought about this. She said, "Sir, I will write the methodology as completely as I know how." So the next pilot who reads it understands which parts required the specific geometry and which parts required the situational awareness, not to replicate blindly. To understand, he said, "That is the best I can ask for." She went to write the methodology. 4 hours. Thorough in the way she was always thorough when what she wrote was going to matter to someone who had not been present. She described the geometry step by step, the ROE considerations, the specific language in the civil aviation regulations that permitted positioning in airspace without constituting approach, the chess principle that had generated the solution, careful to describe it as a specific application to a specific problem, with specific identifiable characteristics, not as a general principle that could be pulled out and applied to anything. She wrote, "This reasoning framework requires the pilot to have a complete understanding of the civil aviation ROE parameters, the specific geometry of the opposing aircraft's position, and the specific resource the opposing aircraft is relying on. A pilot who does not have all 3 of these elements should execute standard procedure. The framework is a supplement to standard procedure for pilots who have correctly identified all 3 elements. It is not a substitute." She submitted it to Emery. He forwarded to NORAD. The review took 11 days. The outcome: recommend inclusion in the ADIZ Intercept TTP as Addendum D, positional denial approach, applicable under specific conditions as described. Emery called her in. He handed her the memorandum. He said, Addendum D, she said, sir. He said, first new entry in the ADIZ Intercept Addendum in 9 years. He paused. The Dear Ops objection is still in your file. He stopped. When I filed the commendation to NORAD, I referenced both. The objection and what you wrote this week. He held her gaze. Both things are in the record, she said. I know. He said, the procedural deviation is also in the record. She said, I know. He said, both things are true. She said, yes, sir. Both things are true. He looked at her. He said, you're the best pilot I have on the alert roster. She said nothing. He said, you're also the most difficult. She said, I know. He said, what I mean by difficult is not what Tate meant when he filed that objection. He held her gaze. What I mean is that you see things before they're obvious, and you are not always patient enough to let the process catch up. He paused. Your job is to close that gap, not by slowing down, by pulling the process forward, she said. That's what Addendum D is, he said. Yes, exactly, she left. Quinn was in the ready room. He had been reading the methodology on his tablet. He said, I've been going through it. She said, what do you think? He said, I think it works. He paused. I also think I wouldn't have seen it in the moment. She said, not yet. He said, what do I need to see it? She thought about how to say it accurately. She said, you need to understand what the opposing crew needs, not just where they are, what they need in order to maintain their advantage. She paused. Most intercepts are about where the contact is. This required thinking about where the contact needed to be. That's a different calculation, he said, like chess. She said, somewhat. My father would say the difference between tactics and strategy is the difference between thinking about your next move and thinking about the position you need in 10 moves. Tactics is where the pieces are. Strategy is where the pieces need to be. She stopped. The aircraft are the pieces. The airspace is the board. Most intercepts are about the pieces. Yesterday was about the board. He thought about this for a moment. He said, how long before you started seeing the airspace as a board? She said, I don't know. She thought about it honestly. It wasn't a moment. It was gradual. She paused. When you've flown the ADIZ enough times, you stop seeing it as empty space that aircraft move through. You start seeing it as a structure, as a set of corridors and zones and restricted volumes that aircraft can use or are prevented from using. Once you see it as a structure, you can think about which parts of the structure the opponent needs. She stopped. Before you see it as a structure, you only see where the aircraft are. He said, that's what the methodology is supposed to teach. She said, the methodology can describe it. She paused. The seeing takes time. He nodded slowly. He said, the Russian crew, when they broke right. She said, professional. He said, they knew what you'd done. She said, they understood the position. That's why they moved. He said, don't you think they were frustrated? She thought about it. She thought about how her father described losing to a superior position. No shame in losing a game you played well. There is only information. The position showed you what you did not see. Now you see it. She said, probably not. She paused. If they're good at what they do, they're thinking about what they learned. Same as me, he said. What did you learn? She said, that they can do this again with a different geometry. I need to think through the other angles. She submitted 3 geometric variations to Emory that afternoon. Possible extensions to Addendum D. Recommend technical review. He replied, forward to NORAD. Cite as your own work. She wrote back, understood. She went home. She sat in her kitchen and looked at the Chugach Mountains in the last of the Alaskan afternoon light, the snow on the upper elevations already thick with the early winter. She thought about the airspace above them, the ADIZ extending 200 miles out to sea, the shape of the board she had been playing on for 3 years, the board that was never the same twice. She called her father. He answered on the second ring. She said, I have a question. He said, go, she said. In a game where both players know the positional theory, how do you avoid them knowing which diagonal you're on? He was quiet for a moment. He said, "You go to a different diagonal." He paused. "Or you play pieces, make them think they're defending against tactics while you're building position." She said, "Misdirection." He said, "Information management. The opponent sees what you show them. Show them the piece, not the diagonal." She said, "Thanks." He said, "How did it go today?" She said, "The way it should have." He said, "Emery." She said, "He authorized the maneuver and documented the procedural deviation." He said, "That sounds right." She said, "It is right." He was quiet. He said, "Tell me what the position was." She described it. The geometry, the 295 behind the Il-76, the two options that would not work, the diagonal she had found, the 90-second hold, the 292-95 breaking right. She described it in the language they had used since she was 6 years old. At the chessboard in the living room on South Wilbur Street in Fairbanks, when the board was small enough to see all at once. He listened. He was very good at listening. When she finished, he said, "The bishop finds the long diagonal." She said, "Yes." He said, "You've been using that piece for a long time." She said, "I like the angles." He said, "I know." He paused. "The board doesn't always offer a long diagonal." She said, "I know." He said, "What do you do when it doesn't?" She said, "You play with what you have." He said, "Yes." He stopped. "You always have something." She said, "I need to keep working. 3 variations I haven't finished yet." He said, "Call me when you have them." She said, "Sunday." He said, "Sunday." She hung up. She opened the notebook to the next blank page. She started writing.